There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, the quiet hum of a refrigerator, the familiar weight of a friend asleep on your couch. You don't recognize them as turning points at the time. They are simply minutes, unfolding one after the other, unremarkable until memory polishes them into the cornerstones of everything that came after. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a cinematic downpour of rain. It was the space between my hand and his, a small, silent gulf of air on a worn tweed sofa, charged with the potential energy of a universe I had, until then, only ever allowed myself to imagine. It was the night Alex, my best friend for the better part of a decade, the immovable object of my affections, and the steadfastly straight man I had built my walls around, left the door to his world unlocked. And I, after years of standing on the porch, was finally contemplating the terrifying, beautiful possibility of walking inside. He was asleep, a state in which Alex always seemed to lose the frantic, kinetic energy that defined his waking hours. In sleep, the sharp lines of his jaw softened, the perpetual furrow of concentration in his brow smoothed into a placid expanse, and his breathing, usually quick and clipped as if he were always on the verge of sprinting somewhere, deepened into a slow, oceanic rhythm that filled the small space of my living room. He had crashed on my couch after another marathon session of coding for a project that was, in his words, sucking the marrow from his bones. This was not an unusual occurrence. My apartment had long been his sanctuary, a quiet harbor from the storms of his own life. A demanding job, a string of dramatic but ultimately hollow relationships, the general chaos of being Alex. I was the keeper of the lighthouse, the steady, predictable beam he could always find in the dark. It was a role I had accepted and even cherished because it was the only one on offer. His left hand was lying palm up on the cushion between us, fingers slightly curled, as if holding onto the ghost of a question. It was this hand that held my attention captive. I knew its topography better than I knew some parts of my own city. I had seen it grip a soccer ball, gesture emphatically to make a point, clench in frustration, and run through his own thick, dark hair in moments of stress. I had photographed it dozens of times, an unconscious study in form and function, capturing the way the tendon stood out when he was focused, the slight callus on his index finger from years of clicking a mouse. But I had never touched it, not really. Not in the way my entire being was screaming at me to touch it now. Our physical contact had always been incidental, masculine, and safe. A clap on the back, a brief, one-armed hug after a victory, a playful shove during an argument over a stupid movie. Anything more was a territory I had cordoned off with warning signs and barbed wire in my own mind, a place too dangerous to even visit in my daydreams. The lamplight cast a warm, amber glow over the room, turning the dust motes dancing in the air into a lazy, glittering nebula. Outside, the city murmured its nightly lullaby, a distant chorus of sirens and traffic that only amplified the profound silence within my four walls. It was in this silence that the debate raged inside me, a war fought on a battlefield no wider than a few inches of upholstery. To touch his hand would be to cross a line, a Rubicon of my own making. It would be an admission, a confession made in the quietest possible language. But what would it mean to him? He was asleep. He would likely never know. It could be my secret, a small, selfish act of taking something I so desperately wanted, a single drop of water for a man dying of thirst. Or, and this was the fear that paralyzed me, what if he wasn't fully asleep? What if some part of his subconscious registered the touch, the warmth, the pressure, and it filed it away as strange as a breach? The friendship we had, this precious, vital thing that was the central pillar of my life, was built on a foundation of unspoken rules. My most important rule was this: do not want what you cannot have. And most especially, do not let Alex ever know you are breaking that rule. His fingers twitched, a fleeting, unconscious movement that sent a jolt through my system. My breath hitched. I watched him, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He settled again, sinking deeper into the cushions, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He looked so vulnerable, so utterly unguarded. The Alex the world saw was a fortress of confidence and easy charm, a man who moved through life with an enviable, seemingly frictionless grace. But I knew the architect of that fortress. I knew about the cracks in the walls, the lonely rooms within, the quiet fear of not being enough that drove him to work too hard, to love too carelessly, to run too fast. I was perhaps the only person who had ever been allowed to see the blueprints. And in that moment, seeing him so completely at rest, so trusting in my presence, the desire to offer a comfort that went beyond words, beyond a spare key and a perpetually stocked refrigerator, became an overwhelming physical ache. It was a gravitational pull, a force of nature I felt powerless to resist. My own hand, which had been resting on my knee, began its slow, treacherous journey across the divide. It felt as if it were moving through water, each millimeter a monumental effort against the current of my own fear. I told myself I could stop at any point. I could retreat, but I didn't. I couldn't. The tips of my fingers brushed against the back of his. His skin was warm, alive. A cascade of sparks, silent and invisible, erupted at the point of contact, racing up my arm and detonating somewhere in my chest. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull away, to wake up, to shatter the spell. But he didn't move. His breathing remained deep and even. And so, with a final, heart-stopping surrender, I let my fingers slide over his, my palms settling against his, our hands resting together in the quiet space between two worlds. It was everything, and it was just the beginning. To understand the magnitude of that single, simple touch, you would have to understand the architecture of the 8 years that preceded it. Our friendship was not a sudden collision, but a slow, geological formation, layers of shared experience and quiet understanding pressed together over time until they became something solid and inseparable. We met in college, in a way that felt like a cliché from a movie I would have been too cynical to enjoy. I was a photography student, tasked with capturing campus life for a brochure, hiding behind my lens as I always did. He was the star of the soccer team, a whirlwind of motion and effortless charisma, the kind of person who seemed to be lit from within. I was photographing one of his games, focused on the raw athleticism, the poetry of bodies in motion, when he scored a winning goal in the final seconds. The crowd erupted, his teammates mobbed him, but through my telephoto lens, I saw something else. For a split second, after the initial elation, his face was completely still. There was a look in his eyes I couldn't decipher then, something that looked less like triumph and more like a profound, aching loneliness. It was a flicker, a momentary glitch in the confident facade, and then it was gone, swallowed by the cheering and backslapping. But I had captured it. That photograph, the one that won me a small student award, was the beginning of us. He saw it displayed in the Student Union gallery and sought me out. I expected arrogance, or at least the easy confidence he projected on the field. Instead, he was hesitant, almost shy. "You saw something," he said, his voice quieter than I expected, gesturing at the print. "I don't know what it is, but you saw it." I, in turn, was a mess of nerves, and used to being the subject of anyone's attention, let alone his. I think I mumbled something about light and shadow, some technical nonsense to deflect from the truth, that I had seen a crack in his armor and felt an immediate, inexplicable kinship with whatever lay beneath it. He didn't press. He just smiled, a real smile that reached those surprisingly vulnerable eyes, and asked if I wanted to get coffee. We talked for 3 hours that day, about everything and nothing. He spoke of the pressure to perform, the strange isolation of being seen as a campus hero. I spoke, haltingly at first, about seeing the world through a frame, about finding truth in the moments people thought no one was watching. It was the first time I had ever felt truly seen by someone who wasn't looking through a viewfinder. Our friendship solidified in the quiet, mundane corners of university life. His dorm was a chaotic hub of athletic energy, so he started studying in my small, single room, which was obsessively neat and smelled faintly of darkroom chemicals. He would sprawl on my floor with his textbooks, while I sat at my desk editing photos, the comfortable silence punctuated by the click of my mouse and the rustle of his pages. He learned to read my moods by the angle of my shoulders. I learned to gauge his stress levels by the speed at which he tapped his pen. We fell into a rhythm. He would drag me out to parties I would have otherwise avoided, acting as a human shield against overwhelming social interaction. I would be the one to make sure he ate a real meal during finals week, leaving a plate of something warm on his desk when he was too engrossed to notice his own hunger. We were a study in contrasts, a perfect, interlocking set of opposite qualities. He was the noise, and I was the quiet. He was the motion, and I was the stillness. He was the sun, and I was the planet that had found a steady, life-sustaining orbit around him. And, of course, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping dawn I was powerless to stop. It was in the way he'd laugh, a full-throated, uninhibited sound that made me feel warm from the inside out. It was in the fierce loyalty he showed, the way he would defend my quiet nature to his boisterous friends. Leo's not shy, he'd say. He's just listening. It was in the small, unconscious gestures of trust, like falling asleep on my lumpy dorm room futon, completely defenseless, knowing he was safe. I knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a curse, that he was straight. He dated a series of bright, beautiful women, bringing them into our orbit with a hopeful enthusiasm that always ended in a quiet, messy heartbreak. I played my part. I was the supportive friend. I listened to him analyze text messages, offered advice I felt wholly unqualified to give, and sat with him in the aftermath, nursing his bruised ego with bad movies and cheap pizza. Each time, a small, treacherous part of me would feel a flicker of hope, which I would ruthlessly extinguish. It was a dangerous, self-destructive cycle. My love for him became a hidden room inside me, a place I never visited when he was around. The door was locked, the key thrown away, but I was always aware of its existence, a constant, low-level ache behind my ribs. After graduation, we moved into apartments in the same city, our bond weathering the transition to adulthood with ease. He dove into the high-pressure world of software engineering, while I carved out a niche as a freelance photographer. Our lives grew more complex, but our friendship remained the constant, the fixed point. My apartment, larger and quieter than his, naturally became our default meeting place, the clubhouse of our two-person society. The rhythms we established in college simply deepened. He had a key. He would let himself in after a brutal day at work, raid my fridge, and collapse on my couch, and we would slip back into that familiar, comfortable silence. I built my life around the negative space he occupied. I arranged my schedule to be free on the nights I knew he'd be overwhelmed. I kept his favorite beer in my fridge, even though I hated it. My entire world was a carefully constructed ecosystem designed to sustain his presence within it, and I was terrified of doing anything that might disrupt that delicate balance. Holding his hand while he slept was more than a breach of protocol. It was a potential extinction-level event for the world I had so carefully built. It was a risk of seismic proportions. And yet, there I was, my palm against his, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse of his blood beneath the skin, and for the first time, the risk felt secondary to the rightness of the act itself. It felt like coming home. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden tremor but a slow, grinding tectonic movement. It began with Sarah. She was the most serious of his girlfriends, a landscape architect who was as grounded as Alex was chaotic. They were together for nearly 2 years, and for a while, I thought he had finally found his anchor. He seemed calmer, more centered. Our late-night sessions on my couch became less frequent. He was building a life with her, and I was genuinely happy for him, a feeling that coexisted with the familiar, hollow ache of being on the outside looking in. I was preparing to recede, to adjust my orbit to accommodate this new, permanent celestial body in his universe. I was practicing the speech for his wedding, steeling myself for a future where I was relegated to the role of good old Leo, the platonic fixture from his past. Then, it all fell apart. The breakup was brutal and swift. I never got the full story, only fragmented, late-night phone calls and a series of bleak, one-word text messages. It was something about the future, about mismatched expectations. She wanted to put down roots, to talk about marriage and houses in the suburbs, and Alex, for all his outward confidence, had panicked. He had sabotaged it. He admitted to me one night, his voice thick with whiskey and self-loathing. He had picked a fight over something trivial and let it escalate until it became a mushroom cloud that incinerated everything. He didn't know why he'd done it. He loved her, he insisted, but the thought of that neat, pre-packaged future felt like a cage. He was adrift. The confident fortress I had known for years crumbled, leaving a man I barely recognized. He was hollowed out, haunted, and he came to me. He started showing up at my apartment at all hours, looking like a ship that had been battered by a hurricane. The first few times, he tried to pretend he was fine. He'd bring a six-pack and suggest a movie, attempting to slip back into our old, easy rhythm. But the energy was wrong. He couldn't settle. He would pace my small living room, running his hands through his hair, his sentences trailing off into nothing. The silence between us, once a comfortable blanket, was now taut with his unspoken misery. I didn't push. I just let him be, filling the space with the quiet hum of normalcy, making coffee, putting on music, being the lighthouse. At the same time, his job, which had always been a source of pride and validation for him, turned into a crucible. His company was going through a merger, and his team was under immense pressure to deliver an impossible project on an even more impossible deadline. The man who had once thrived on stress was now being crushed by it. He was working 14-hour days, fueled by caffeine and sheer willpower, and then coming to my place to decompress, though he never seemed to truly unwind. He was frayed at every edge, stretched thin to the point of transparency. I could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the new, premature strands of silver at his temples. He was losing weight. He looked haunted. This confluence of crises, the emotional devastation of the breakup and the relentless, soul-crushing pressure of his job, was the catalyst. It stripped him of his defenses. The easy charm, the social armor, it all fell away. He was raw, exposed, and profoundly lonely. His friends, the boisterous group from his soccer days, tried to help in the only way they knew how, by dragging him out to bars, telling him to get back out there, offering platitudes that bounced right off his new, fragile surface. He needed something else. He needed quiet. He needed a place where he didn't have to perform. He needed me. And so, my apartment ceased to be just a sanctuary. It became a field hospital for his wounded spirit. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was taking refuge. The lines of our friendship, so clearly drawn for so many years, began to bleed and blur, the colors running together into something new and undefined, something that filled me with a terrifying, exhilarating hope. And so the ritual began, born of his exhaustion and my silent, unwavering willingness to provide comfort. It started innocently enough. One Friday night, after a particularly hellish week, he arrived at my door looking like a ghost. He barely spoke, just sank into the corner of my couch and stared blankly at the television, which wasn't even on. I made him tea, which he held in his hands for warmth but didn't drink. We sat like that for an hour, in a silence so dense it felt like a third presence in the room. Eventually, his head began to nod. "I should go," he mumbled, his words slurred with fatigue. "Don't be an idiot, Alex," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Just sleep here. The guest room is ready." He looked at the guest room door, then back at the couch, and shook his head slightly. "Too much effort," he whispered, and before I could argue, he had slumped sideways, pulling one of the throw pillows under his head, and was asleep in seconds. I watched him for a long time before covering him with a blanket. It felt significant, his choice to stay in the main room, to remain in my proximity even in unconsciousness. That night became the template. He would work himself to the point of collapse and then navigate on autopilot to my apartment. The pretense of watching a movie or hanging out quickly faded. He was coming to my apartment to sleep. The couch became his bed. At first, I kept my distance, retreating to my desk or my bedroom, leaving him to the living room. But he seemed to dislike it. If I moved away, he would stir in his sleep, a low, troubled sound in his throat, as if my absence was a disturbance. So I started staying. I would sit in the armchair across from the couch, reading a book or editing photos on my laptop, standing vigil. I became a professional watcher of Alex sleeping. I learned the subtle shifts in his breathing that signaled a bad dream, the way his hand would clench when a thought about work pierced his rest. Then, the geography of our evenings began to shift. The space between us started to shrink. One night, I was sitting on the far end of the couch, trying to give him space to stretch out. He was restless, tossing and turning, caught in the grip of some silent anxiety. In his sleep, he shifted, rolling toward the back of the sofa, and then again, moving closer and closer to my end, as if drawn by a magnetic force. He eventually settled with his back pressed against the cushions, his head just a foot from my thigh. My entire body went rigid. I was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the heat radiating from him, of the scent of his shampoo, a clean, sandalwood fragrance that felt dangerously intimate. I didn't move for over an hour, my muscles screaming in protest, terrified that the slightest twitch would break the spell. The ritual escalated from there, in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. The next time, he didn't even bother with the pretense of taking up the whole couch. He just collapsed onto his usual side, leaving the other half for me. I hesitated for a moment, my internal alarms blaring, before cautiously sitting down. We were sharing the space now, a silent agreement passing between us. We watched an old movie, the dialogue a low murmur beneath the more important conversation being had by our bodies. He fell asleep halfway through, his head lolling to the side until it came to rest, with a soft, definitive weight against my shoulder. My heart stopped. I am not exaggerating. For a full second, I forgot how to breathe. It was the most profound physical contact I had ever shared with him. It was accidental, a product of gravity and exhaustion, and yet it felt like a confession. I could feel the texture of his hair against my neck, the warmth of his breath on my collarbone. I sat there, a living statue, until my own exhaustion overtook me and I drifted off, my head eventually leaning to rest against his. We woke up like that in the pale light of dawn, tangled together in a way that felt both shocking and completely natural. He pulled away quickly, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, and mumbled an apology before rushing off to his own apartment. But a door had been opened. The plausible deniability of sleep was his shield and my torment. He could initiate this staggering intimacy without ever having to acknowledge it. Was he aware of what he was doing? Was some subconscious part of him reaching for a comfort he couldn't ask for with words? Or was I just a convenient, warm body, a piece of furniture that happened to be alive? This question became the central obsession of my life. I analyzed every sigh, every shift in weight, every sleepy murmur, searching for a clue, a sign that this meant something more. My photography suffered. My own life felt like it was on hold, waiting for a verdict to be delivered in a language I couldn't speak. The couch, my worn, comfortable tweed couch, became a stage for this nightly drama of unspoken need and unrequited love. It was a space of exquisite torture and sublime comfort. He would fall asleep against me, his hand sometimes ending up resting on my leg, his breathing a steady rhythm against my chest, and I would feel a sense of peace so profound it almost made me weep. In those moments, with his guard completely down, with the weight of him a solid, trusting presence against me, the lonely, hidden room inside my heart felt, for the first time, like it was filled with light. But then the morning would come, and he would retreat behind his wall of casual friendship, and the door would slam shut, leaving me alone in the dark again, wondering if I had imagined it all. This ritual, this cycle of closeness and distance, became our new normal, a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful dance on the edge of a precipice. The night of the crossing arrived without any particular fanfare. It felt, in its opening moments, like any other night in our new, strange reality. Alex was on the couch, but he wasn't asleep. He was just lying there, staring up at my ceiling as if searching for constellations in the plaster. A heavy rain was falling outside, a relentless drumming against the window panes that seemed to insulate us even further from the rest of the world. The air in the room was thick, charged with a static electricity I could feel on my skin. He had been quiet all evening, a deeper, more troubled quiet than usual. I had tried to draw him out, asking about his day, but his answers were monosyllabic, his gaze distant. So I had let the silence settle, a familiar companion. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the armchair, ostensibly sorting through a box of old prints, but really just giving him space, watching him from the corner of my eye. After a long time, his voice, when it came, was so soft it was almost part of the ring. "Leo." I looked up. He had turned his head on the pillow and was looking at me. In the dim light, his eyes seemed vast and dark. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice a little rough. "Can you come sit up here?" he asked. It wasn't a command, but a plea. A simple request that felt loaded with 100 unspoken meanings. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I got up from the floor and moved to the couch, sitting on the edge of the cushion, leaving a careful, deliberate foot of space between us. It felt like a chasm. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the things we had spent years not saying. "I'm tired," he said finally, and it was a statement of such profound, bone-deep weariness that it seemed to encompass more than just a lack of sleep. He was tired of the pressure, tired of the loneliness, tired of pretending. "I know," I said. It was all I could offer. He shifted, turning onto his side to face me fully. He propped his head up on his hand, his elbow sinking into the cushion. The movement brought his face closer to mine. I could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the tiny flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He held my gaze, and for the first time, there was no filter, no friendly deflection. He was just looking at me, and he was letting me look back. It was terrifying. It was the most honest moment we had ever shared. "Can I ask you something stupid?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm outside. A small, nervous smile touched my lips. "Always," I whispered back. It was our old joke, our shorthand for the permission we gave each other to be vulnerable. He took a breath, a slight, shuddering intake of air. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a maelstrom of emotions swirling there. Fear, confusion, and a desperate, heartbreaking flicker of hope. He was on the edge of the same precipice I had been living on for months, and he was looking at me as if I was the only thing that could stop him from falling. "Would it be okay," he began, his voice cracking on the last word, "if I kissed you?" The world did not stop. It did not slow down. Instead, it fractured. The single, stable reality I had so carefully curated for 8 years shattered into a million glittering, terrifying, beautiful possibilities. The sound of the rain, the hum of the lamp, the feeling of the tweed fabric beneath my hand. It all became hyper-real, seared into my memory. My mind, usually a chaotic torrent of analysis and second-guessing, went completely, blessedly silent. There was no debate. There was no fear of ruining our friendship. There was no thought for tomorrow. There was only this moment, and this man, and the impossible question hanging in the air between us. It was a question that offered me everything I had ever wanted, wrapped in the guise of his own need. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was giving me the power, the choice, after all this time. I couldn't find my voice. The word yes was a tangible thing stuck in my throat. So I just nodded. A single, small movement of my head that felt like the most significant gesture of my entire life. Relief washed over his face, so potent it was like watching a dam break. He closed the small distance between us with an agonizing slowness. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, repeated in a different language. His lips were soft, hesitant, brushing against mine with a tentative uncertainty. It was a kiss of discovery, of someone mapping a new and unknown territory. I could taste the salt of what I realized were his tears, a silent testament to the storm he had been weathering inside. I responded with equal gentleness, a quiet affirmation. My hand, acting of its own accord, came up to cup his cheek, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there. The touch seemed to steady him, to anchor him. The kiss deepened slightly, becoming not just a question, but an answer. An answer to months of ambiguous cuddling, years of unspoken affection, a lifetime of my secret, hopeless love. It was a quiet, desperate, and profoundly beautiful confession in the middle of a rainstorm, and it changed the entire geography of my world. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter than the storm itself. The world feels washed clean, fragile, and new. That was the morning. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight was filtering through my blinds, striping the floor with pale gold. I woke up alone. For a disorienting moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, that the kiss had been just another phantom of my wishful imagination. But the indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to mine, and the air still held the faint, lingering scent of him. We had fallen asleep on the couch, not separately as we had before, but properly together, my arm around his waist, his head tucked into the curve of my shoulder. It had been a sleep so deep and peaceful it felt like a form of healing. But now, the silence of the apartment felt different. It wasn't comfortable, it was empty. On the coffee table, next to my mug from the night before, was a single, folded piece of paper. My stomach plummeted. It was a page torn from the sketchbook I always left out. His handwriting, usually a confident scrawl, was tight and jerky. It contained only 5 words. "I'm sorry. I'm a mess," that was it. No explanation. No promise to call. Just an apology and a retreat. The fragile, beautiful world that had been born just hours before crumbled into dust. The silence in my mind from the previous night was replaced by a screaming chorus of self-recrimination and despair. I had misread everything. The ritual on the couch, the vulnerability, the question, the kiss. It had all been a symptom of his breakdown, not a revelation of his heart. He was lost and confused, and I had been a port in the storm, a temporary safe harbor. And now, in the clear light of day, he regretted it. He was sorry. He was a mess. And I was the fool who had mistaken a desperate act for a genuine one. The friendship, the one thing I had guarded so fiercely, was now a casualty. I had crossed the line, or rather, I had allowed him to pull me across it, and in doing so, I had broken everything. The next 3 days were a special kind of hell. I cycled through every stage of grief for a relationship that had only existed for a few precious hours. I was hurt, then angry, then numb. I sent him a single text message, "Are you okay?" It remained unanswered, a single blue check mark on my screen that felt like a judgment. I called him once, and it went straight to voicemail, his familiar, cheerful greeting a cruel mockery. He was avoiding me. He had disappeared behind the walls of his fortress again, and this time, I was locked out. The pain of it was a physical thing, a dull, constant pressure in my chest. My apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a crime scene. The couch was a monument to my own stupidity. Every corner of the room held a ghost of him, a memory that was now tainted with rejection. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any potential confirmation of my fears. I had to see him. I had to hear it from his own mouth. I walked the 6 blocks to his apartment building, my heart pounding a nervous, unsteady rhythm with every step. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the wood, my mind racing. What would I say? Would he even open the door? Finally, propelled by a surge of desperate resolve, I knocked. 3 sharp raps that sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside, a shuffling sound, and then the lock turned. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, looking even worse than he had before. He was unshaven, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt, and his eyes were bloodshot and shadowed with sleeplessness. He looked at me, and I saw not anger or disgust, but a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He didn't say anything, just stood there, blocking the doorway. "Alex," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me and then disappear. You owe me more than a 5-word note." His eyes fell to the floor. "Leo, I can't," he mumbled. "Don't," I said, a new, sharp anger cutting through my pain. "Don't you dare hide from me. Not after everything. Let me in." For a long moment, I thought he would close the door in my face. But then, With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his energy, he stepped back, opening the door wider. His apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers littered the counter, clothes were strewn over the furniture, and the air was stale and heavy. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state. He didn't turn to face me, just walked to the center of the room and stood there with his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice raw. "Stop apologizing," I said, my voice softer now. "Just talk to me. Tell me what's going on in your head. Did I misread it all? Was it a mistake?" He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. "No," he whispered. "It wasn't a mistake. That's what's so terrifying." And then it all came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession and confusion. He spoke about the breakup with Sarah, about the suffocating feeling of the future she had planned for them. He talked about his job, the pressure to be perfect, to be the reliable, high-achieving guy everyone expected him to be. And he talked about me. He talked about how my apartment was the only place he felt he could breathe, how my quiet presence was the only thing that had kept him from completely falling apart. He admitted that the nights on my couch weren't accidental. He had been consciously seeking out my closeness, my warmth, driven by an instinct he didn't understand and was too afraid to examine. "I'd lie there," he said, his voice cracking, "and I'd pretend to be asleep, and you'd be sitting there, and I'd just feel safe." For the first time in months, I felt safe. The kiss, he explained, hadn't been a moment of weakness. It had been a moment of clarity. In that quiet, rain-soaked room, everything else had fallen away. The expectations, the pressure, the life he thought he was supposed to want. And the only thing that felt real, the only thing that made sense, was me. And it had terrified him. Because these feelings, this profound sense of rightness he felt with me, it didn't fit into any box he had ever built for himself. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the implications. He was running from a truth about himself that upended his entire identity. "Who am I, Leo?" he asked, his eyes pleading with me for an answer he had to find himself. "If I'm not the guy who dates women and builds a normal life, then what am I?" I closed the distance between us, and, for the second time in our lives, I initiated a touch that was more than friendship. I took his hand, the same hand I had so timidly held just nights before, and laced my fingers through his. This time, he gripped back, his hold tight and desperate. "You're Alex," I said, my voice firm and clear. "That's it. You're just Alex. And I'm just Leo. And whatever this is," I gestured between us, "we can figure it out. Or not. But you don't get to run. We don't run from each other." Tears welled in his eyes and finally spilled over, tracking paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. He just stood there, holding my hand, and let me see all the broken, beautiful pieces of him. And in the wreckage of his apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his turmoil, we finally began to build something new. The resolution was not a sudden, cinematic epiphany. It was a slow and quiet reconstruction, built brick by brick with honesty and patience. That conversation in his messy apartment was the true foundation of our new reality. The kiss had been the earthquake that brought the old structures down. The talk was the act of clearing the rubble and deciding what to build in its place. We agreed to take it slow, a pace dictated by his need to reconcile his heart with his head, and my need to believe that this was real and not another temporary state of being. The ambiguity that had been my torment for so long was replaced by a deliberate, gentle intentionality. The couch was the first thing to change. It was retired from its role as our emotional battleground. The next time he stayed over, there was no pretense of him being too tired to make it to the guest room. I simply looked at him as the evening was winding down and said, "My bed is big enough for two." There was a moment of hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by a soft, grateful smile. He just nodded. That first night sleeping in a proper bed together was a revelation. There was no plausible deniability, no accidental contact. When he reached for me in the middle of the night, pulling me closer until my back was flush against his chest, it was a conscious choice. When I woke up with his arm slung protectively over my waist, his breathing a warm, steady presence against my neck, I knew it was where he intended to be. The simple, domestic intimacy of it was more profound than any grand romantic gesture. It was an intimacy of trust and acceptance. The physical language between us began to evolve. A hand on the small of my back as I made coffee. His fingers lacing with mine as we sat in the comfortable silence of my living room, reading our respective books. A soft kiss on my temple before he left for work. These were small, quiet gestures, but they were a constant affirmation, a new dialect we were learning together. Each touch was a sentence. I am here. I am choosing this. You are my safe place. He was still Alex, still driven and occasionally chaotic, but the frantic, restless energy that had defined him for so long began to subside. He was settling, not into a life he felt pressured to live, but into himself. He started smiling more, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. He started taking pictures with me again, not as a subject, but as a partner, seeing the world through my eyes and showing me how he saw it through his. His friends noticed the change, of course. They saw him becoming calmer, happier. When he finally told them about us, it was with a simple, unapologetic directness that I admired. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just introduced me one day not as his best friend, but as his partner. There were a few raised eyebrows, a couple of clumsy questions, but for the most part, they accepted it with a shrug. They could see he was happy, and in the end, that was all that mattered to them. The life he had been so terrified of losing, the identity he thought was so rigid, turned out to be far more flexible than he had imagined. He wasn't losing anything. He was just adding a new, more honest room to the architecture of himself. One evening, a few months into our new beginning, we were sitting on the couch, the same couch where everything had started. We were watching a movie, my head resting on his chest, his arm wrapped around me, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my arm. It was so normal, so easy, that the memory of the anxious, charged nights that had once taken place on these very cushions felt like a scene from someone else's life. He tilted his head down and kissed the top of my head. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "I think I was falling in love with you for years. I was just too stupid and scared to call it by its name." I smiled, a real, uninhibited smile, and tilted my head up to kiss him. "I know," I said. "I was just patient enough to wait for you to figure it out." We had found our way out of the storm. Not into some perfect, sun-drenched paradise, but into a quiet harbor, a place of mutual safety and profound peace. The unspoken had finally been given a voice, and the language it spoke was one of love, acceptance, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two people building a home together. The door he had left unlocked that night hadn't just been an invitation into his world. It had been an invitation into my own future. And I had learned that some moments, the ones that arrive disguised in the quiet of an ordinary evening, are not turning points because they change everything in a flash, but because they open a path you choose to walk down, hand in hand, discovering the landscape of a new and beautiful world together, one step at a time. We began to heal, not in grand pronouncements, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together.